right, I think the recording is started. So welcome everybody to another meeting of the Federalist Society at SLU. First, I'm going to start with a quick introduction of the chapter and what we do, what we stand for, and then an introduction of our speaker, Mr. Woodson. The Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy Studies is a group of conservative and libertarian lawyers, law professors, and students interested in the current state of the legal order. It is founded on the principles that the state exists to preserve freedom, that the separation of governmental powers is central to our Constitution, and that it is emphatically the province and duty of the judiciary to say what the law is, not what it should be. To that end, today we have Mr. Robert Woodson Sr. He is the founder of the Woodson Center and also the progenitor of the 1776 Unites movement. He founded the center in 1981 to help residents of low-income neighborhoods address the problems of their communities. A former civil rights activist, he headed the National Urban League Department of Criminal Justice and has been a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Foundation for Public Policy Research. Referred to by many as the godfather of the neighborhood empowerment movement. For more than 4 decades, he has had a special concern for problems facing the youth of America. In response to an epidemic of youth violence that has afflicted urban, rural, and suburban neighborhoods alike, he has focused on much of the Woodson Center's activities on an initiative to establish violence-free zones in troubled schools and neighborhoods throughout the nation. He is an early MacArthur Genius Awardee and the recipient of the 2008 Bradley Prize, the Presidential Citizens Award, and the 2008 Social Entrepreneurship Award from the Manhattan Institute. With that introduction, he wants to speak to us today a little bit more about his newest endeavor, the 1776 Unites movement. And so without further ado, Robert Woodson.
Well, thank you. This is a pleasure being here. I've spoken around the country to some of the local Federalist societies, particularly at Columbia University and also in the University of Virginia. So I'm just delighted to return. I think we are at a moment in our history, not unlike 1860. Today, we're either going to fortify our institutions and our commitment to constitutional government, or will it all be torn down and replaced by a ghastly dystopia in which the only thing that is relevant is our identity? Power will accrue to those who are woke and those Americans who want to build a world through family church will be purged. A political movement on the left that began with a concern for justice for Black Americans, they have instead betrayed Black America and profited off of the self-demise of that community. 1619 is really the culmination. This is the special insert that was written in August 2019 by Nicole Hannah-Jones, a Black journalist at the New York Times, as you know, who organized a group of Black scholars and primarily journalists. And they issued a special edition of the New York Times Sunday edition called 1619, where they defined America's really birth date from the year 1619, the time when Black slaves, 20, first arrived on our shores. And through these various essays, they go on to really define America as the 1776, the date of our founders, as invalid because half of the signers of the Declaration were slave owners, and therefore they said that America is really a slaveocracy and capitalism was built on the backs of slavery, and therefore America is incurably racist in its DNA, I think they said, and therefore all whites have benefited and therefore have privilege to be sanctioned, and all Black people are victims to be compensated. And so since this was really an assault on the fundamental institutions of our society, and they were using the Black America's troubled America's birth defect of slavery really as its tool and an instrument to really discredit the founding of the nation. And so because of the messengers were Black and they were abusing the rich legacy of the civil rights movement, we thought it was important for the response, the messengers in response to 1619, to also be African Americans or Blacks. And so what we did was organize 23 plus Black scholars and activists around the country. And our effort is not intended to offer an alternative debate with the 1619. What we were offering is an alternative narrative, an inspirational and aspirational narrative that will tell the accurate story of America. And so since they were using false claims that many of the trials and tribulations confronting Black America today is attributed to the legacy of slavery, the out of wedlock birth, the violence that is consuming our cities, that somehow the disparities that exist in education, that all of these problems that many Black in the Black communities are confronting are directly related to the legacy of slavery and discrimination. So what we did with our essays is very carefully debunk this false narrative that America is Black America is only defined by oppression, by slavery, Jim Crow. And so what we did was go back and tell, through our essays, an accurate account of Black history, that we have a legacy of self-sufficiency, of self-reliance. And so in our essays, for instance, to debunk this lie, we talked about at the end of slavery in 1865, according to some of our scholars, when they looked at the records of 6 major plantations, they found that 75% of those families who were slave families had a man and a woman raising children. So even in slaveries, Blacks had nuclear families, that the literacy rate among freed slaves was something like 75% were illiterate. And within less than 50 years, that rate had declined from 75% down to 25%. And when the Freedmen's Bureau sent agents south to help Blacks learn to read, they reported back that there was no need for the government to intervene because the Black community in the South has set up what they call Sabbath schools, where churches were established and taught Blacks to read. Historians tell us never in the history of the world has a population gone from the 75% illiteracy rate down to a 25% in less than 50 years. There were other signs of resilience in the Black community. For instance, 1619 talks about the disparities in education that exist today. But when you look back in history, between 1920 and 1940, the education gap between Blacks in the South and whites in the South, with whites it was 8th grade, and for Blacks it was 5th grade. But in less than 20 years, between 1920 and 1940, that gap closed within 6 months. And that is because Julius Rosenwald, the CEO of Sears, partnered with Booker T. Washington, and they put up $4.8 million to the Black community. The Black communities in each of these various communities in the rural South raised a matching $4.8 million. And these communities built themselves 5,000 what they call Rosenwald Booker T schools. There was a proliferation of schools. They operated with used textbooks and only a small percentage of the budgets for white schools. And yet studies revealed that they were able to close the education gap within 6 months. And the same was true when Blacks were denied access to hotels, and medical schools. We built our own. In every city in the country, when Blacks were denied access to hotels, they built. In Atlanta, Georgia, there was the Walla Haji, the Carver and the Calvert Hotel in Miami, the St. Teresa in New York, the St. Charles in Chicago. So when we were denied access to medical school, we built Meharry, Tuskegee University. And even in 1868, when Blacks were fired from the docks of Baltimore, Maryland for striking, we borrowed money from our burial societies and built and established our own railroad that successfully operated for 18 years from Baltimore to Maine. And so, there were 5 Black high schools in 1920s in all of our major cities. There was the Ballou High School in Washington, D.C., in Atlanta, and in New York and New Orleans. There were these Black high schools. People like Colin Powell went to them. And we had 50 to a class with used textbooks, half of the budgets of white schools, yet in every one of these Black high schools, Blacks scored higher than any white schools in the city. So what we do through our essays is report on how Blacks achieved, in the face of discrimination, how they went from persecution to prosperity in the face of this. We established our own banks, our own insurance companies. Another myth that they were saying that the out of wedlock births between 1930 and 1940, at a time when we were in a depression. The unemployment rate for whites was 25%, for Blacks it was 40%. But still, the marriage rates for Blacks during that 10 years of the Depression, when racism was enshrined in law, we had no political representation. Jim Crow was the law. Still, our religious faith and our families, we have the highest marriage rate of any other group in society. In Chicago, people were talking today about redlining. Well, in 1929, in the city of Chicago, in the Bronzeville section of Chicago, there were 731 Black-owned businesses. Blacks owned $100 million in real estate assets in those cities, in Chicago rather. So there is a rich tradition of achieving against the odds in these cities because of the self-determination and resilience and perseverance of Blacks. But all of this rich history of self-help and self-determination is totally ignored by 1619. And historians don't tell those stories. There were many Blacks who were born slaves who died millionaires. And I could tell you story after story of how they were able to accomplish it. One of our businessmen you'll know about because his name is famous and legendary. There was a man called Elijah Mccoy in Chicago who was born of fugitive slave parents. And they found their way to Canada, where he was born and raised and educated as an engineer. And when he sought a job at the Chicago rail yards in 1848, because he was Black, it didn't matter that he had an engineering degree. They gave him the worst job and the most dangerous job on the railroad, and that was to oil the wheels on the train wheels. Well, he did so, but he also invented a machine that automatically lubricated the wheels. And he became rich as a consequence. And you'll know his name because when others tried to develop knockoffs, the owners of the railroad said, no, we want the real McCoy. So that name, the real McCoy, came as just an example of, again, a perseverance of the. But all of this progress in education and economic development, family stability, it all came to a crashing halt in 1964 with the start of the poverty programs. It came to what racism couldn't do, what Jim Crow could not destroy. Large segments of Black America could not withstand the impact of liberal policies of the 60s. Because up until 1965, 78% of all Black families, as I said, had a man and a woman raising children. Welfare was frowned upon. It was stigmatized in the Black community. But those on the left, Cloward and Piven at the School of Columbia University School of Social Work, following the Watch riots, what they said, what they need to do is, in order to demonstrate the moral inconsistencies of capitalism and force America to go to socialism and to redistribution of income, they used the Black community as the means of accomplishing that. They said if we could separate work from income, it would make the father redundant. Also, it means that crime will go up, school dropout rates, and then people would flood into the welfare system. But they couldn't just do this by their policy track. The federal government also cooperated by opening poverty offices where Blacks were recruited. But in order to change the stigma, welfare was changed from social insurance to reparations. The women's movement supported this cultural shift. The Black Power movement also said that the nuclear family of a man and a woman raising children was Eurocentric and therefore racist and to be discarded. So you had, and then the ACLU, when the welfare departments in the various cities were requiring women to report the paternity of the child as a condition of welfare, they were sued for violating the privacy rights of these mothers. And as a consequence, this was changed. And it was a combination of the cultural change, the legal, and that between Fred Siegel, in his book, The Future Once Happened Here, documents the fact that within a 3 to 4 year period, millions of Blacks flooded into the welfare system in our major cities, particularly in New York, where the unemployment rate was only 4%, and yet welfare. And so what you saw, what racism and Jim Crow could not accomplish, this cultural shift. And on the economic front, we also saw the expansion of eminent domain, and the urban renewal came through and bulldozed many of the communities that had private businesses, all of the major business sections, all of the Black Wall Streets that thrived in the 30s and 40s and 50s were bulldozed down, and freeways came through those communities. So there was a combination of liberal policies, both economic policies that destroyed commercial centers in the Black community, and also on the cultural and education front, there was a moral dumbing down of the community. And as a consequence, what we're witnessing today is a result not of slavery and discrimination as contended by 1619, but it was a combination of policies, economic and social policies of the 60s, liberal policies that resulted in this decline. And so what we're witnessing today is with Black Lives Matter and others, they are capitalizing on this distressful situation and using the Black community as a bludgeon against the country. And that's why when George Floyd got killed in Minneapolis, Minnesota, they quickly latched on to this and began to masquerade as doing this to assist in confronting social injustice of the Black community. But as soon as they did, they hijacked the rich legacy of the civil rights movement. And as soon as they did, they migrated from justice for Floyd, through burning Bibles in Portland, to denigrating the Christian cross. They said it was a symbol of white supremacy, to tearing down the statues of World War II statues, and even Frederick Douglass, who was an abolitionist, his statue was torn down as well. So what they're now doing is really, the fight is really against cultural Marxism. What they're trying to do is do this in the name of social justice for Blacks. And so the solution from our point of view is Blacks have been betrayed, and the moral authority of the left is determined by their alleged support for social justice for Blacks. So what we're doing at the Woodson Center in 1776, we are mobilizing the Black community to stand up and push back against this hijacking of their movement. We are working with hundreds of Black mothers of children who were killed in these urban wars, and they are standing up and going to say, we are against the defunding of the police. 80% of the Black America is opposed to many of the positions taken by Black Lives Matter. But with the complicity of the media, this word has not gotten out. We're also supporting institutions in the Black community that they are operating on the foundation of our principles. In other words, the principles of family, faith, and education were fundamental to the survival of Blacks over the century, enabled them to survive slavery and Jim Crow. But these very institutions that insulated Blacks and helped them to achieve, in spite of the odds of slavery and discrimination, are being torn down and torn asunder by the left. And so now we believe at 1776, we need to do outreach to that same Black community. Low-income Blacks are the sleeping giant in America. And I think we are trying to mobilize them to speak for themselves. And so what we're encouraging people to do is invest in institutions in the Black community whose foundation is built based on the embrace of the values of and principles and virtues of our founders. Let me stop there and answer whatever question people may have.
All right, thank you for your remarks. And then we will open up the floor to questions. If you have questions, there's a number of us on the call. So I think the easiest way to get this done is to either drop a question in the chat feature, and I'll read those and ask Mr. Woodson those, or if you can raise your hand and then I'll call on you and you can unmute yourself and talk that way. So if anyone has questions, please use one of those methods. And I may just start off with, that was a lot of history in about a 25-minute period. And so I want to focus a little bit on what you said about the shift that happened in the 1960s, particularly after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I'm not quite sure how to paint that act, because all the way through school, even from people from all sides of the political aisle, it's a good thing, right? It's how we got rid of Jim Crow.
The Civil Rights Act, no, the Civil Rights Act was fine. I'm talking about the poverty programs.
The poverty programs, okay.
Not the Civil Rights Act. No, the Civil Rights Act, giving Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act were fine. I'm talking about the poverty programs of the 60s, 65.
Okay, so like
poverty
Great Society.
Programs. Yeah, the Great Society program, not the Civil Rights Act. Absolutely not. If that was, no, absolutely not. But it was the poverty programs.
Quite. Once again, anybody who wants to post questions in the chat, they can. Otherwise, I will just keep going.
Well, one of the big myths that you hear today is this whole term of systemic racism. And I believe that it is a political construct. It does not describe the conditions under which Blacks are suffering. Because I really think it's being used by many politicians who've been running these, if racism were the pervasive problem today, the question is, why are these inequities occurring in cities that have been run by Black liberal politicians for the past 50 years? Part of the promise of the civil rights movement, that is, if with the Voting Rights Act, if you were to elect Blacks to the offices of mayors, school boards, hospitals, all of these, if we as a people were running these institutions, then our people would be treated better. And so the question is, why are all of these inequities, the decline in education, the crime, why are these all occurring in cities run by Blacks? How does systemic racism work that way? If Blacks achieve almost more under de jure racism, why have conditions deteriorated? That's the question.
All right. Thank you for your answer on that. We have a question from the chat asking, what are your thoughts on the cancel culture? Is this related to what you call the cultural Marxism movement, or is that something outside of what 1776 Unites is touching
No,
on?
it is absolutely a central part of what they do, and that is to silence dissent. That one of the qualities of the civil rights movement was the quality of the debate. There is no debate today. There was an editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer that made a simple statement that all lives matter. He was fired. So there is a gag rule that is imposed upon anyone that challenges. In Loudoun County, Virginia, there is a policy that is circulating among its school board that says that race grievance training will be a mandatory part of the school system, and that no school employee is permitted to comment or criticize it, either in their personal social media or publicly. No teacher or no employee is permitted to even challenge of this. So no, the cancel culture is alive and well, and a central tool on the part of the left to maintain control.
All right. Thank you for your answer on that. Another question from the chat. What can I do as a Christian to support Black pastors who seem to have the key to Black power or the Black community?
I think there are centers of moral excellence in these communities, and that's what you must seek out. There are churches that have schools and who are fortifying those traditional values. I urge you to go to those churches and go to those centers of moral excellence and physically support them, donate to them, volunteer, but we must have enough courage to speak up and support those in the communities. We just had a major fundraiser for a Christian school in Mississippi called the Pineywood School. It is 110 years old, and it has Black children at risk who come there. 96% of them are from really troubled families, but 96% go on to college. And they have mandatory chapel, mandatory work. And so they have been operating for 110 years based upon the old values of personal responsibility and Christian faith. They need to be supported.
Thank you, Mr. Woodson. I have a question from the chat asking if you have read Juan Williams' book, Enough, which provides an interesting history and account of African Americans starting in the 20s. And I guess to branch off of that question also, what are other sources, maybe even outside of 1776 Unites, that you would call required reading if someone was wanting to get more involved?
There is, but we have a whole library, a reading list on our website, 17, not just books by our authors, but by others. Fred Siegel's book, The Future Once Happened Here, is what I would recommend. Anything written by Shelby Steele, Thomas Sowell, And so those are some of the books that I would recommend. I have a new one coming out in December called Lessons from the Least of These. I have another book called The Triumphs of Joseph, where I use Joseph as a metaphor from Genesis as to what the proper relationship should be between the rich and the poor. So if you go on our website, we have a whole library of books that we recommend, not just our members, but books on the subject.
Excellent. We have another question from the chat. To what extent is 1619 and the 1619 project being taught in K-12? And what effect is there of Black children being taught that they're victims and white children being taught that they're privileged oppressors?
It is the most diabolical phenomena to occur in decades. It's almost worse than what happened during segregation, because our children are being separated by where Black children are being told they're suffering from what President Bush called the soft bigotry of low expectations. In San Diego school today, it says in a paper that because a preponderance of Black children fail, they're going to change the grading system, that Black kids tend not to turn in their homework on time. They're no longer going to be required to do that. And they're just lowering the bar for Black children. And on this video, a little Black child, a white student says, oh, I agree with the policy, because after all, Black children don't have the same advantages that I do. So we are really poisoning our children to believe that if you're white, you're privileged, and if you're Black, you are a victim. And nothing is more lethal than to say to someone they have no capacity to be agents of their own uplift, that somehow their destiny and their future is determined by people who does not like you. It's a devastating, that's what's happening. 1619 is being distributed to over 3,000 public schools throughout the country.
And that stat alone is a pretty remarkable thing, because if you think about it, every year you're pumping a whole nother class worth of students into whatever school that goes into. We have a couple questions in the chat about pivoting a little bit from 1776 Unites to the Woodson Center as a whole, more specifics, wanting more specifics about what the Woodson Center does to promote and assist Black people in their communities. And then also, if you're aware of other groups similar to the Woodson Center that do what you do, or how what you do is different.
Well, first of all, we serve not just Black students, Black people, but also low-income people of all races. We've worked in Appalachia, we worked on Indian reservations, we've worked all communities. And in the 40 years that I've had the center, we've had many conferences. Race never came up one time at any of our conferences, because 80% of the people that the Woodson Center serves are something. They are people who are overcoming brokenness in their lives. And when they get together, they discuss their brokenness and how they have overcome their brokenness. So they always explore and exchange their path towards redemption. We go into high crime, drug-infested neighborhoods, and we look for strengths. We look for people who are raising children successfully against the odds. And we think they are social entrepreneurs, and we find them. If they're helping 10 people, we help them through training and technical assistance and access to money so that they can grow, so they can help 50 people, and from 50 to 200 people. So we go in like Miracle Grow and like a Geiger counter and find centers of moral and spiritual excellence. And then we apply Miracle Grow in the form of training and technical assistance, so that we begin to help communities heal from the inside out and the bottom up. And so we got some remarkable examples of communities that have been transformed from drug-infested, crime-ridden neighborhoods to some of the safest communities by mobilizing people there to take charge of their lives and also restore their community.
We have a follow-up question about your Joseph book, and asking if you could talk a little bit more about Joseph as that example.
Yeah, Joseph, as you know, was from a family of 12 sons. He was a favorite of his father, and who had him in his old age. But he also, his father was favored him and gave him a cloak of many colors. You know that story. But Joseph was also arrogant. When he told his brothers and his father that he saw you bowing down to him. And he angered his brothers, so they sold him into slavery. And Joseph found himself in the house of Potiphar. But he became the best servant. And Potiphar's wife lusted for him. And Joseph refused to have sex with her because he had, as I said, horizontal integrity and lateral integrity. He said it would be a violation of the trust to my master and also a sin against my God. So she accused him of an attempted rape, and so he was imprisoned. And he stayed there for many years, about 13 years. But even in prison, Joseph became the best prisoner. And one day when Pharaoh had a dream that none of his experts could interpret, Joseph was brought before Pharaoh and told to bow down before Pharaoh, and he refused because he said, it would be a sin against my God. So Pharaoh knew he had integrity. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, I can't interpret dreams, but God does, but I'm merely a vessel. In other words, Joseph had become cleansed of self-importance and was humbled. And he told Pharaoh there'd be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine, to save up 20%. And appoint an overseer. And Pharaoh appointed an overseer, and that was Joseph. But think about how powerful that was for a rich and powerful Egyptian to place second in charge a 31-year-old uneducated Hebrew shepherd who was an inmate. And so we look at that as a metaphor. We go into low-income communities and we look for the Josephs. And there we look for in households where people are in poverty, but not of poverty. They're raising children that are not dropping out of school or in jail or on drugs. But the other type of Josephs, those who have fallen to become gangbangers and prostitutes, but through God's grace, they've been redeemed. And therefore, they are powerful witnesses to others that redemption is possible. And so the Woodson Center bases its whole work in urban communities by going into these communities and looking for those two types of Josephs. And once we find them, we provide them with training and technical assistance. And we try to identify good pharaohs, people with wealth and power and knowledge, to partner with them so that communities can be rebuilt from the inside out.
Thank you for that answer. That actually covers a number of other questions that were popping up in the chat as you spoke. We were getting more, so that's wonderful. I wanted to pivot a little bit away from within that that same cultural Marxist vein. There have been at least accusations that that's not only in the 1619 Project, but within BLM.
Oh yeah.
But you know, BLM is Black Lives Matter. There's been a ton of movement towards Black leaders sitting down with people from other communities within BLM. Is BLM the same thing as 1619, or is that something different? And are they helping out the Black community?
They're not helping. First of all, we must make a difference between Black Lives Matter. They do, but Black Lives Matter as an organization is Marxist, and they work in conjunction with 1619. But if you go look at their website, they're anti-family, they're anti-Christian values. They Black, and they raise millions of dollars. I can't think of a single instance where any of that money found its way in the Black community. Corporations are just falling over themselves, writing checks to Black Lives Matter, profiting off of white guilt. And so, but Black Lives Matter is a destructive force. They are a tool, they're Marxist. On their website, they will tell you that they're Marxist, and therefore they just took down the one page that said they are hostile to the nuclear family. But for years, they said that the nuclear family should be abolished.
That in and of itself is a little crazy to me. So it's taking a while to kind of get my mind back for the next question. I am interested a little bit in, you told the story of Elisha McCoy, and I always enjoy hearing those stories. I'm sure other people on the call do too, and we have a saying, and this is where it's from. And especially when that's a story of resilience and overcoming like his, but that's one story. So do you have another story or more statistics or something about that period where you're saying, even during segregation and Jim Crow, that this narrative pivot from oppression to resilience?
Yeah, I'll tell you a famous one, Robert Smalls, who was built in Sumter, North Carolina in 1839. And he found, he was on working on a supply ship for the Confederate Army. And one day when his master went ashore on a Friday night, he and the members of his crew stole the ship and picked up their families and put his master's hat on and his coat. And he went past 5 Southern garrisons and turned the ship over to the Union Navy. He was celebrated and went on a tour of the North, but because of his courageous act of turning over a supply ship, he was given $1,500 by the Congress. Also, it convinced Abraham Lincoln to allow Blacks to fight in the Civil War. And so what happened was, after the war was over, he became a very successful businessman doing reconstruction. Robert Smalls was also served in Congress several terms. What's interesting about him, he went back and purchased the plantation on which he was a slave. He found that the wife of the slave owner and her siblings were destitute. Robert Small took them in to the home. And because his wife was delusional and didn't realize that the war was over, he permitted her to continue to sleep in the master bedroom. To me, Robert Smalls is an example of radical grace in action. And there are other stories like that. Biddy Mason, born 1818 in Mississippi, illiterate, had 3 babies, one by the slave master, walked behind a wagon for 1,000 miles from Mississippi to Salt Lake City because her master was a Mormon. She walked behind a wagon to California and found out it was a free state, and she was freed. And she was a midwife and earned about $1.50 a day and saved for 10 years and purchased land downtown LA, which is now, built a property and rented one, and became a very successful real estate entrepreneur and a philanthropist. And she was the founder of the AME Church there. And she died with a net worth in today's dollars would be like $6 million. So there are a lot of courageous stories like Biddy Mason, Robert Smalls, Madam C. Walker. There are hundreds of stories of places, even cities like Durham, North Carolina, and Greenwood section of Tulsa, where Blacks actually built a Wall Street, where businesses and hospitals and whatnot. And all of these are chronicled in our essays.
Thank you. I love those just because for me, I love a good story, right? And to be able to do that, and even the way classical education was done, where, you know, we're learning, and this is it's stories of white guys, right? the ancient Greeks, and it's the Livy's. And so to be able to work some of that in even to the way we learn now, I think would be something I would have benefited from.
Well,
Robert Smalls, for instance, was a great man. Like, everything about that story is awesome.
Yeah, we named a, there's another story that I think is important. In 1943, when people today are talking about, in order for Blacks to compete, it's important to lower standards. And that's just destructive. For example, in 1943, there were no Black naval officers. They were prohibited from being naval officers. So Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of President Roosevelt, insisted that the Navy train. So they took 16 Black male college graduates, and the Navy decided to put them through cadet training. Only they were going to give these cadets in 8 weeks what they give white cadets in 16 weeks. And so when these men found out what they were doing, they covered their windows in their barracks and stayed up all night and studied. And when they were tested, they scored in the 90th percentile. And then the Navy, thinking they had cheated, retested them individually. And then they retested in the 93rd percentile. Well, they're called the Golden 13. You should read about them, the Golden 13. But the reason they go, because the Navy only allowed 13 of them to be commissioned. But today, they set a record as having scored the highest of any class graduating from the Naval Training Center. Today, their record still stands. So there's an example of perseverance, of achieving against the odds. And I think all children, Black, white, need to know that this is how people responded at the time, not the way Black Lives Matters or the race grievance people. Our children ought to be inspired by victories that are possible, not always reminding them of injuries to be avoided.
Another question from the chat. This is pivoting back to, as you mentioned earlier, George Floyd, and kind of where BLM in 1619 really got their momentum. This is asking, as the wife of a police officer, I get to see the personal side of policing. With the force of social media, is there any hope of defeating the idea of police being a negative force in society?
Absolutely. We, as I told you, first of all, the reality is, someone said, either we have to accept fact-based truths or lies become normal. So everything I'm sharing with you is factual. But in the course of a year, maybe 1,000 people are shot by the police. 80% of them, the police were provoked because they were assaulted, which means there were 2% that are unarmed. Of those, only about 14 or 20 were Black. And so but we act as if this is an epidemic. So Black Lives Matter demanded defunding of the police. Well, 80% of the Black community believes that they should not defund. They need the police. We have organized a group of Black mothers who lost children to urban violence, and they are getting ready to come out publicly with our auspice and declare that they support the police, and they want to be involved in the training of the police so that the police can better serve them. The more the police are vilified as being racist occupiers, the more they withdraw their enforcement of the laws, the higher the murder rate goes up. So, but none of the advocates who are talking about defund the police have to live with the consequences of their advocating. They don't live in these crime-ridden communities. They don't have to suffer the consequence of their assault on police officers. But we have another program, for instance, in Las Vegas, Nevada, where was started by a man named John Ponder, who was an ex-offender who came to Christ And for the last 10 years, he has helped about 3,000 people coming out of prison to get settled in society, only 6% recidivism rate. And he has about 500 volunteer mentors. 40% of those 500 mentors are police officers. So in Las Vegas, the police officers are mentoring, in some cases, the very people that they arrested. And as a consequence of this close relationship, violent encounters between police and citizens have dramatically declined as crime has gone down. So there are places where there are examples of really high quality police community cooperation. And what we're trying to do at the Woodson Center is promote more of these kind of situations where the police are again given the respect that they deserve.
Thank you again for that answer. You have so much data all the time and always a good story to come along with it. And so I wanted to pivot, as we are the Federalist Society, we're a law-based group. Wanted to go to some policy recommendations that have been made. I got a question from the chat that is asking about California. California recently formed a committee to plan how reparations could be distributed within the state. What's your position? Could you elaborate a little bit on your position on reparations?
You know, my position on reparations is suffering can be endured and overcome, but it cannot be compensated. It is really an insult to even discuss reparations in a serious vein. First of all, there were freed Blacks who owned slaves. They were Native Americans of the 5 civilized tribes. They owned slaves. Now, do their offsprings pay or are they receive? There were thousands of whites who never owned slaves, who came here after slavery. So why should they pay? It's really a ridiculous proposition, and it cheapens the whole issue of social justice to think that you can monetize pain and somehow write a check. It is a product of just, I think it's an insanity.
I think there's going to be a number of tort lawyers very upset to hear that you cannot monetize pain. But from a different policy standpoint, I want to ask then, what are your policy fixes, if any, outside of what groups like 1776 Unites, what groups like the Woodson Center do to help out their communities on the personal level? Are there policy prescriptions you have?
Yeah, there are some. For instance, I think that there's one very practical thing. I think that we can deprofessionalize service delivery. For instance, you can raise 5 children successfully and send them all to college, but if you don't have a master's degree in early childhood education, you can't take care of children. But you can have a master's and hate children and still get licensed. So we really think the whole issue of certification to serve people as a condition of qualification should be re-examined. And it should be some character-based standard that we use to determine who qualifies to serve. Another policy is that we don't hear about that lawyers can help with. My daughter lives in Costa Rica and she's married with her family. I call her or she calls me at least 4 times a day. That's a new baby. But if she were in prison, it would cost her about 80 to $1 a minute to talk to me. So that $1.2 billion goes into the hands of 2 or 3 communications companies that have contract with prisons, that people, in order to stay in touch with families or lawyers, have to pay these exorbitant fees to even communicate, where 40% of the money goes to the prison and 60% goes back to the company. That is something that should not, the exploitation of people in our prisons is something that should stop. These are the kind of practical policies that one can pursue that would have an immediate benefit of helping families, and also elderly mothers spend $500 a month just talking on the phone to children, to their kids. So these are the kind of nitty gritty, down and dirty policies you should look at when you're trying to talk about being of help.
Well, that last policy, I had never heard anyone mention that one before. That's a new one to me, with the phones in the prisons. And
Look into
I think
it.
that's something a lot of people on this call and a lot of people that I know at the school that are not on this call would be happy to get behind. And so I will look more into that. If you have any more information on that sort of stuff, is that on the site or?
No, I can send it. If you send to me, I can send you information. But if you could Google it, talk about it, because there's an organization in DC made up of lawyers that are, in fact, struggling, but they're a small outfit and they don't have much support, but they could use support. That's the kind of thing that I think conservative lawyers should be getting behind, rather than always looking for issues that can be argued before the Supreme Court.
Sure. So we're getting close to time. We have about 3 minutes or so until our hour is up. So if you have any closing remarks for us, any words of wisdom you want to leave us with, any books or materials you want to pitch, anything that you want to say in the next 3 minutes or 2.5 minutes, the floor is yours.
Well, I really think that the conservative movement needs to engage in sort of self-examination of how it allowed this to get this way. In 1994, when the conservatives took over the House, and there was a great celebration of the conservative victory, I remember being in an auditorium in the Mayflower Hotel with George Will and Grover Norquist, all of the prominent conservatives were there. They were celebrating the conservative victory. And I asked a question that provoked silence. I said, tell me what a conservative victory means for the least of God's children. There was dead silence. I think conservatives have got to do some soul searching when it comes to the whole issue of poverty, and not just embrace policies that impose sanctions on people who are on welfare, but also reach out on issues like I just told you about telephones. Black and brown women are being sexually assaulted every day in prisons. Some of them are having children by guards, but no one is coming in and championing for them. But they are insisting that white women and other middle-class Black women be appointed to boards of directors as a way of addressing the issues of women. So I would hope that your young lawyers would be looking specifically at opportunities to help the least of these, those who are marginal, who are in need the most. I would hope that you would focus some attention on that group rather than some of the more esoteric issues that may be of intellectual importance to you, but totally irrelevant to the least of God's children.
And I think that's about a wrap. Mr. Woodson, thank you so much for your time today, for sharing your expertise, your opinions, and some good history with us. I don't know about anyone else on the call, but I'm feeling like my load's a little lighter, like I've gotten good intel. But if you want to feel a little perhaps less rosy about the world, we do have a debate in an hour or so. With that, I think I'm going to close. But thank you again so much for your time, and thank you everybody for logging on to the call.
Thank you.